Good evening and welcome back to People's University live stream, Bugs and People. And as you can see tonight, we're not taking any chances. We have the PowerPoint up. Dr. Kritsky is with us, and we'll introduce him in just a second. I just have a few announcements. On June 8th at noon, that's Tuesday, our Lunch with Books live stream. The Wheeling Poetry Series is back with Anna Egan Smucker and Bill King are the poets. And our West Virginia Poet Laureate, Mark Harshman, is the host, as usual. And next week, next Thursday, June 10, so a week from tonight at 6:30, this series will continue with insect evolution and the Orthoptera order. That's grasshoppers, to we non-experts. Dr. Elizabeth Rowan is the Service Assistant Professor of Entomology at WVU and also has a lot to do with their insect zoo, which is an awesome idea, an insect zoo. And let me just say before we start that I have the cicada art with me tonight that Bob made. I'm going to hold it up for you, and we'll look at it at the end too. But all you have to do is go into the library and take your picture with the giant cicada and put it online and tag the library, and you can have a chance to win that and other prizes. And we'll give away some books tonight. We have Dr. Kritsky's book, Periodical Cicadas, Brood 10 edition, that I'm holding here and he's holding there. And we'll give away 2 copies of that, as well as a Brood PU t-shirt like the one I'm wearing, or you can have a tote bag, your choice. Okay. Now, he was here last week, but if you weren't here, let me introduce our guest for this evening, Dr. Gene Kritsky, Dean of Behavioral Natural Sciences and a biology professor at Mount St. Joseph University in Cincinnati, Ohio, where Brood 10 is thriving right now. He received his PhD in entomology from the University of Illinois. Editor of American Entomologist, he has authored or edited 10 books and over 250 papers on subjects as diverse as entomology, Egyptology, dinosaur biology, and insect mythology. He's the author of Tears of Ray, Beekeeping in Ancient Egypt, and the Periodical Cicadas that I just showed you, the Brood 10 edition, which is a new book. Here is Dr. Gene Kritsky.
Thank you, Sean. Sorry about that. Thank you, Sean. It's good to be with you all again. I hope you had a good week. I know I certainly have. Today I had the joy of being in the midst of choruses of Brood 10, screaming at 80 and 90 decibels until the rains came in. This evening I saw something I'd never seen before, and that is the sun was shining and the cicadas were all on the tops of the leaves singing and then flying from branch to branch. And then it got really cloudy and really dark. And just as the sprinkle started, I went back outside, and these cicadas, which are on top of the leaves and the branches, had now crawled underneath the leaves and are riding out the storm, dry, high and dry in the leaves. You know, some people don't have the sense to get out of the rain, but cicadas certainly do. And I was just tickled as all get out to see that today. So my goal this evening is to pick up where we left off last week, which is where cicadas fit in nature. We covered all that, and now to talk to you about periodical cicadas in particular, and Brood 10, which is the largest of the 17-year cicadas and is getting a lot of attention throughout the eastern U.S. So as just a brief review, what are cicadas? Cicadas are insects. They're insects with piercing, sucking mouth parts belonging to the order Hemiptera. Those include other insects such as bed bugs, which you see in the lower left here, 1426. This is from my book, Survey of Entomology. On the lower far right are stink bugs, the family Pentatomidae, and those are 2 relatives of cicadas, but not close relatives. Closer to cicadas are aphids, and aphids belong to an order, a former order, used to be called Homoptera. And if you have the Peterson Field Guide to the Insects, they still use that term in there. They're now put into the Hemiptera in different suborders. Within that order, there's the family Cicadidae, and this is the family of cicadas. That family belongs with another family, the family of hairy cicadas, into the family Cicoidea. But we're going to focus on the family Cicadidae. And I am often asked, We have cicadas every year. What's so special about what's going on this year with these periodical cicadas? Well, it turns out there are, depending on where you live, a large number of cicada species in your area. Here in Ohio, where I'm living, we have 20 species and subspecies in the state of Ohio. We have 6 species of periodical cicadas, 3 13-year and 3 17-year. And we also have 14 species and subspecies of annual cicadas. And you can see it side by side in this illustration. This is not to scale to each other, but the annual cicadas on the left come out starting usually around early July, and they're usually around until middle October. And depending on the temperatures, you'll hear them in the trees going bzz, 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 starting in August and extending into early October. If you can see on the illustration here, they've got green eyes. Some have darker black eyes. There's almost like a straight line between the eyes. These are very large. They're bulky insects, long wings. In some cases, the wings extend twice as long as the length of the animal. So here's the whole animal here, and the other half of the length is going to be based on the wings. These come out in very small numbers. They are cryptically colored. They're camel colors, you can see from the coloration here, and they're hiding in the trees. On the other hand, the periodical cicadas, which we have emerging now in parts of the eastern U.S. in 15 states and the District of Columbia, they have bright red eyes, they've got black bodies, and they've got membranous wings with orange veins. And that's the physical differences. Their behavioral and ecological and population demographics are quite different as well. They come out in enormous numbers. It's just amazing. Whereas you have difficulty finding an annual cicada up in the tree, you're going to have no trouble seeing a periodical cicada. In many cases, as one happened to me this afternoon, they'll fly into you because you're walking in their flight path. They're clumsy. They're not strong flyers. Their whole survival strategies come out in massive numbers to overwhelm their predators. So they also come out in May, and they're usually gone by the end of June. So there's a cutoff point. Excuse me. We have a special wasp, the cicada killer wasp, which has evolved to feed on the annual cicadas and rarely is out with the periodical cicadas. It depends on how cold it's been, if they'll overlap or not. Excuse me. Let's look at the different species here. We have excuse me, 2 life cycles. We have a 17-year life cycle and a 13-year life cycle. What you're seeing here are the 3 species of 17-year life cycle cicadas. Looking at from the top, what you see is one large species and 2 smaller species, and superficially look the same except for the size difference. You flip them over and they look very different indeed. Indeed, on the lower left, you have Magicicada septendecim, which is mostly orange with a little bit of black on the abdominal segments. In the middle is a Magicicada castani, and in the far right is Magicicada septendecula. Notice those very fine, very neat, very distinct green band, orange bands. Excuse me, I'm colorblind today. Orange bands on the abdomen. The specimen in the middle of the 3 is a female, and so you can look at the shape of the abdomen and very easily tell the difference between the sexes. The males have a more square, bluntish tip to the abdomen. The females is much more pointed. These are the 17-year cicadas. It is sometimes possible to get confused between the far left septendecim and the far right septendecula. There's one other trick you can use. If you look at the adult septendecim, you'll notice here's the eye, the red eye. From the base of the eye to the base of the wing, there's this large orange patch. That is only found in septendecim. If you have very neat, fine abdominal bands of orange, lines of orange, and you do not have these orange bands, you're looking at the rarest of the 3 species, and that's septendecula. Nationally, we have 4 species of 13-year cicadas, 2 large and 2 small. And that's because the large species, which has a very similar call to each other, actually had a 17-year cicada evolve a new 13-year life cycle. So we'll talk about this. So the 2 on the far left are Magic cicada. The farthest left, neotridecim. Then the second from the left is tridecim. The second from the right is Triticacini, and the farthest to the right is Tridecula. If you turn these over, you'll notice that this specimen here on the far right, neotridecim, looks superficially very much like the underside of septendecim. And that's because if we look at the mitochondrial DNA, they're almost identical. And indeed, it appears that sometime in the last few thousand years, there's been a life cycle switch that turned this 17-year cicada septendecim into a 13-year tridecim. We have tridecim here that we're looking at, the second from the septendecim to neotridecim, excuse me. The second from the left is tridecim, and notice how the bands are almost entirely orange on the abdominal segments. No, very little, if any, black at all. That's tridecim. Both tridecim that we see are second from the left and the far left, neotridecim, have very similar calls, but they are different pitches, and they actually segregate in nature. The neotridecims that we see here on the far left only mate with males, and females only mate together with that same color pattern. The same is true with the tridecim, the second from the left. We have the counterparts that we saw with the 17-year cicadas, the Magic cicada Triticacini, all black on the underside. Their call is nearly identical to what we see with the 17-year form. And here is Magic cicada Tridecula. Notice these very fine, very distinct orange bands here. Without the orange bands, you can see the orange here and the orange here. You do not see that at all in the Tridecula. So now you're an expert in all 7 species of periodical cicadas by looking at these color patterns. Now we also classify periodical cicadas as broods, and broods are year classes. And this is a process that was started by Charles Marlett back in the 1890s. Up to this time, there were 3 different systems of how to name year classes of cicadas. 2 of them were called broods, but the brood numbers were different between the 2. A third one based on Gideon B. Smith, he just had emergence year. And it was really confusing. You also would find publications with little tables to tell you which brood was the same as which brood in each of these classifications. Charles Marlett, who was an entomologist for the United States Department of Agriculture, decided to propose bringing some continuity to this. And he basically said, okay, we're starting in 1883. In 1883, every 17-year cicada that emerged in 1883, we're going to call that brood 1. Every 17-year cicada that emerged in 1884, that belongs to the brood 2. And that numbers 1 through 17 are reserved for 17-year cicadas. And if you're a 13-year cicada and you emerged in 1883, you belong to brood 18. And numbers 18 through 30 are reserved for the 13-year cicadas. So already when I say we're talking about brood 10 this year, that should tell you immediately this is a 17-year cicada brood. And it's number 10, starting from 1893 and repeating every 17 years later as it corresponds. And this was an amazing point of clarification. The confusion that resulted in all of the maps up to this time, with all these overlapping and not agreeing brood numbers, disappeared. And we started looking at, okay, 1893. Let's talk for that brood 10. If you came out in 1902, you're brood 10. You come out in 1919, you're brood 10. You come out in 1936, you're brood 10. Once you had that continuity, the maps started to come together. And we started seeing patterns between the development of the broods. And that really clarified all sorts of things. And in the end, it turns out we discovered that the periodical cicadas are unique to the eastern deciduous forests. They occur, as you see from this map, only in southern Wisconsin and southern Michigan, upstate New York, and they don't go any further south than southern Georgia. They don't get into Florida, although there were reports many years ago that they were, but they were never been able to verify that. They don't get down to the far coast in Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi. They just get in the very northeast corner of Texas, southern Oklahoma, and then just west of the state line into eastern Nebraska, Kansas, and northeastern Oklahoma. That's where we see all the broods for together. The blue dots are 17-year cicadas. The red dots are 13-year cicadas. And it turns out when we started looking at these brood classes, we discovered there were 15 known broods, 12 broods of 17-year cicadas and 3 broods of 13-year cicadas. And once we had that continuity in the numbering systems, we started comparing those maps once every 17 years. All the cicada broods started to cluster. I'm not going to go through each one of these individually, but you'll notice up in the upper right, there's brood 1 in western Virginia, eastern West Virginia, and very southwest corner of Virginia and northeastern Tennessee. Brood 2 is along the Atlantic coast. Brood 3 out in western Illinois and Iowa and northern Missouri. Brood 4 in the far left in the middle line. It's the only brood that occurs entirely west of the Mississippi. And that particular brood is found in Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Texas. Brood 5. This is one of the broods you get in West Virginia. Brood 5 occurs in the east half of Ohio and covers the northern half of West Virginia and a little bit into Virginia proper and a little bit into southwestern Pennsylvania. Brood 6 is an interesting order. Found well established in western North Carolina and northeastern Georgia, probably into South Carolina as well, but we don't have good documentation there. But there have been some strange occurrences, a lot of other cicadas emerging during brood 6 years, and that's because cicadas tend to spin off 4-year accelerations, and 4 years before 10 is 10 minus 4 is 6, so we see a lot of brood 6 populations beginning to start to pop up. Brood 7 is probably the most threatened brood of all the periodical cicadas, occurring only in just a couple of counties in northern New York. Brood 8 also gets into West Virginia. It gets right in the very northern sticky uppy bit in West Virginia. In fact, 2 years ago, I was in West Virginia mapping this out in some of the state parks in that area. Brood 9, which came out last year, is in southern West Virginia. I spent several days, 4 days in total, in West Virginia mapping out Brood 9. Also occurs in Western Virginia and northwestern North Carolina. And then our last remaining broods of the 17-year cicadas includes Brood 10, which you see in the upper left. That is the one that we're talking about today, and we'll talk more about that as we get into it. That's the largest of all the 17-year cicada broods, as you can see here. We don't have a Brood 11. We don't have a Brood 12, but we do have Brood 13, and that's what's next. That's in the northern half of Illinois, southern Wisconsin, into Iowa, and just in the northwest corner of Indiana. Brood 14 and Brood 10 overlap, as you can see, but what's going on here is 14 is slowly disappearing as its progeny accelerate to come up with Brood 10. Those are the 12 17-year cicada broods. The 3 13-year cicada broods are what we see in red in the bottom. Brood 19, there's no Brood 18, there's no Brood 20 or 21, or Brood 24 through 30. There's only 3, Brood 19, 22, and 23. And one of the things I'm most proud of in my lab is in the middle of the bottom section there, this population, the red dots you see in southwest Ohio, northern Kentucky. That was one of the discoveries made in my lab, was the discovery that we did have a 13-year brood this far north in Ohio and Kentucky. And here it is. Here's your periodical cicada decoder ring. The oldest historical record we have is for Brood 14 in 1634. That's the very top row here under Brood 14. Remember, the brood number is always written in Roman numerals. And the oldest Brood 10 that we have goes back to 1715. And with Brood 10, we've recorded cicadas emerging during every single one of these years up to and including 2021. The next two are 2038 and 2055. And here's the map of Brood 10 based on the 2004 distribution. 2 big areas, one in the east side that covers parts of New Jersey, Delaware, southeastern Pennsylvania, almost the entire state of Maryland, and parts into Virginia. And then we have another cluster out here in the Midwest with almost the entire state of Indiana, part of the western part of Ohio, some in southern Michigan, and then scattered throughout northern Kentucky and eastern Kentucky. And Tennessee has some scatters out in the west, and then a good number east of Knoxville. And then there's some in western North Carolina and northern Georgia. This year with Cicada Safari, my mapping app, we have now documented cicadas emerging in Alabama, and in South Carolina. So already, with the help of citizen scientists, we have been able to expand the range of brood 10, which was important because in the past they've been noted to have occurred. Brood 10 has been noted to occur in Alabama, but was since discounted, and it's never been shown to be in South Carolina. And we have at least two really good, solid records of emerging in South Carolina. So, what do you look for? Unfortunately, you're outside of the range of brood 10, but if you have a chance to drive west or drive east into where brood 10 is emerging, you'll get a chance to see what's going on. We had our first signs of what to appear with cicadas is the production of these chimneys, these little mud turrets, if you will, where after a good heavy rain, the cicada nymph living underground in this tunnel tries to extend its tunnel above where the water is. Because if you have a heavy rain, this picture was taken after a 24-hour period of not intense rain, but constant rain. And our soil here has got a lot of clay in it, and the movement of the cicada up and down in its tunnel made the sides nice and smooth, and the water started to accumulate in the tunnel. So that triggers a behavior in the cicadas to actually ball up little bits of mud and extend the tunnel above ground. And they're going to be up here on the top of this little chimney, waiting out the rain. After the rain stops falling, that water will slowly percolate out of the tunnel, and they'll go back down, and they'll recap it further on. But these chimneys will persist. The cicadas, that started here in around the 15th of April and continued for the last 2 weeks. We saw just some form of a couple of weeks ago, in fact. When the soil temperature reaches 64 degrees Fahrenheit, again, after a nice soaking rain, that's when the immature cicadas start to come out of the ground. And here's one I captured less than 5 seconds after it broke forth from the soil. I was with a film crew from Japan at the university, and they had lined up a big circle of lights to try to capture these things coming out of the ground. And it turned out the lights were keeping them from coming out. I was very disappointed. So I turned around, walked out of the circle of light, if you will, and I looked down to the flashlight, and here they're popping out of the ground behind all the cameras. So we turned everything around quickly and were able to capture these things just as they popped out of the soil. That has not seen the light of day. In fact, they won't see it right now because it's pitch black. It's after sundown. A new cicada nymph coming forth from the soil. They come out of holes in the ground that are about the size and diameter of your pinky. And this particular photograph is taken at one of the most intense sites I ever studied. This is just half of the site, but this is a 1 square yard location where they came out at a rate of 356 per square yard. I don't know about you. That's a lot of bugs. That's a lot of bugs. The inset photograph you're seeing there, after all the cicadas had emerged, I decided to see, I wanted to investigate what their tunnels looked like. So what I did is I mixed up some plaster of Paris and I poured it down the holes, let it harden for a few days, and then excavated it out like it was an archaeological dig. And you're looking at 3 of the tunnels. The one on the far left is about 6 inches deep. The other 2 about 8 inches deep. And you can see they sort of meander down. The one in the middle is really telling because you've got that little lobe off here to the lower right where the cicada nymph could walk headfirst down, back up, and turn around in that lobe, and then move headfirst out. That's really kind of cool. They come out in incredible numbers. And as soon as they start crawling out, they want to crawl up a vertical surface. And they come out and they start crawling. And they get onto a vertical surface where they lock their tarsal claws onto a trunk of a tree or a brick wall or a fence. I've seen them do this on tires. And they're getting ready to transform themselves from the last immature stage, the nymph, which you see here, into an adult cicada. And if you look carefully, along the back, you'll see that the nymphal skin starts to split at the thorax. And inside, you see that creamy white adult cicada showing itself. That crack extends through the pronotum and into the head capsule. And out of this crack wriggles out an adult periodical cicada. It's pulling itself out of that nymphal shell, eventually going to hang almost totally upside down, being held only in place by the tension of the skin holding its abdomen in place. These white filaments you see coming out, those are the old breathing tubes of the nymphal cicada that have to be pulled out of the adult before the adult can breathe properly. They sit like this for about 20 minutes. What that does is it allows their tarsal claws. They've got two little claws at the end of each of the legs, and it allows that to harden enough so when they do a cicada sit up and they grab forward on the skin of the nymph, they can get purchase and actually pull their abdomen free. And now you have, for the first time, an adult periodical cicada free of its nymphal skin, but it's not totally mature yet. It doesn't have its normal wing shape and its coloration. So these wings have to expand. And what happens is it will expand its wings by pumping fluid through the veins, and that slowly makes the wings longer, until they get to the point where the wings are held tent-like over the abdomen, complete venation, but notice it's still creamy white with the red eyes and those black patches. To get to this point, from when you saw the cicada first pop out of the ground, this takes about an hour and a half. It's going to take another hour and a half, in part depending on air temperature, for them to totally change into that dark adult periodical cicada, which we recognize today, with its red eyes, black body, and its orange veined membranous insect wings. Now, they're not ready to start singing and mating yet. What'll happen now, this is, as you see, it's dark. This is after the sun's down. These cicadas will make their way to the tops of trees, to the tops of fences, anywhere they get high enough out of the ground, because it's going to take them another 5 days to mature into an adult. They're going to need to continue hardening their exoskeleton, and they got to mature their reproductive structures to get ready to start singing, to mate and attract an offspring. If you miss this the first night, you wake up the next morning, you walk outside, and the whole place is covered with these ghostly shells, these ghostly reminders of what had happened the night before. A lot of biology is found in these shells. You can take them to determine the sex, you can determine the species, and so a lot of times we go and collect all these shells after the first day, and then the second day and third day, and we work out what's the sex ratio of each day of the emergence. It turns out more males emerge first than the females, and then for about 7 days, after about a week, more females start to emerge than males. And they keep coming in numbers, more and more and more. They just don't seem to stop. And this is all part of their whole survival strategy to feed their predators, which includes raccoons, squirrels, rodents, birds, even a few people will eat their fill of these things. And there is still millions of these bugs out there. And I would say in the last 24 hours here where I'm sitting in Southwest Ohio, this is what happened. Today we crossed this Rubicon. When I left for work yesterday to the university, there was a cicada here and there. Came home this evening, and there was a cicada almost on every leaf in the shrubbery around the house. And they are just everywhere, ready to sing and start the whole process. And they started coming out here on the 17th. And so that was about 2 weeks ago. And we've had singing here for the past week, but nothing like we started getting today. Of course, what's going on now is the adults on average live about a month, but it takes a full 2 weeks for all these cicadas to emerge in a single yard. So it takes 2 weeks for all the cicadas come forth. The first ones live about a month. The last ones live about a month. So they'll be here from the beginning to the end, from the first cicada to the end, about 6 weeks. So they come out in the middle of the month. They'll be done by the end of June. What happens is that these cicadas are going to be singing. The males are going to be singing to attract a mate. And you're looking at a male cicada I'm holding between my fingers. Right in the very middle there, you'll see this sort of whitish structure that's got these sort of lines running through it. That's called the tymbal. It's membranous, and there are muscles on the inside that when they contract, cause those ribs to buckle. And when they do, it causes a small sound. If you take a bendy straw and you stretch out and pop it back and forth, that's what's going on here. That kind of a tension snap release. You do that a couple hundred times a second, and you've got a call being made. Moreover, the male abdomen is mostly hollow and serves as a resonating chamber to make the noise even a little bit louder. And the whole process of this mating call is to attract a female. There are 3 distinct calls. The male from the largest species, I'll simulate it with a whistle, is very precise. It goes, and if a female is nearby and she hears that, she can't sing in response because she doesn't have any tymbals, but she does flick her wings. So when the male sings, she'll flick her wings at an exact moment to show she's interested. Each time the male hears that wing flick, he'll walk closer to her. Sometimes there'll be a second male nearby, and he'll hear that the female's responding. So what that second male will do, he'll start singing before he gets to the point where the female will flick her wings, confusing the female, so she starts flicking her wings to that male. So it can lead to some kind of competition. After the accepted male is closer to the female, he'll go into a second call, which is, and then he gets closer, starts tapping her on her back, her thorax, with his foreleg, and begins the process of mating. Mating takes approximately 45 minutes to several hours, depending on what's happening in the area around them. You'll find them tail to tail, side by side. But I've just started seeing mating pairs starting 3 days ago. So we're beginning the mating process here in Ohio, Kentucky, and Northern Kentucky and Southwest Indiana. After mating is done, the female lays her eggs in the new growth of trees. And you see in the upper left-hand corner here, here's a female with this large dark structure, which is puncturing the terminal ends of a tree branch. This is about the thickness of a pencil. And on the upper right, you'll see here's an enlargement of the ovipositor. It's the egg-laying structure. And it's got these lines on the very distal and the very far tip here off on the right. And in the cartoon that you see in the lower left is what's actually going on. There's a stabilizing rod in the middle. And on each side, there is 2 digging blades, and they're serrated. And as the female pushes that up against the branch, those serrated edges, like a steak knife, start sawing into the wood. Some of the research that I did recently with Matt Leonard of Kent State University at Stark Campus, and it was published in Nature Scientific Reports, found that these serrated edges on that blade at the tip there are reinforced with metal to help them saw through the branch of the tree to actually get inside to lay the eggs. And as you see here on the lower right, you'll see right in the very center are all these egg clusters. There's another batch over to the left. In between is the line where the egg ovipositor was injected, and she lays a pair of eggs on each side as she withdraws her ovipositor. And she'll keep laying eggs like this until she A, runs out of branch, which she flies to a branch, or B, runs out of eggs. And she, on average, has about just a little more than 500 eggs to lay. This is what the egg damage looks like. The egg nests are about 1/4 inch long. And let's take the middle one as example here. The second one from the right, she will have stuck her ovipositor into the branch. And in the process of laying the eggs, she literally tears up the vascular tissue and then walks 1/4 inch down and does this again. And walks 1/4 inch down and does this again and keeps going, laying 10 to 20 eggs at a time. It's maybe up to 40 in some instances, until she finishes depositing all of her eggs. Now, this can be harmful to the trees, and this is why some cicadas have been known to be a tree pest, if you will. This will sometimes tear up the vascular tissue of a mature tree, causing the leaves to wither and turn brown. We call that flagging. And they'll even break at that point, sort of dangle off the branch. And this flagging can indeed harm a very, very young tree, 3 feet or shorter. But for a mature tree like these oaks that you're seeing here, that doesn't harm them at all. Indeed, it looks like it even produces a greater flower set in subsequent years. So this does have a benefit to the tree in the long run. Now, these egg nests persist. They don't lay any more eggs. No more eggs are going to hatch. And I should point out that the eggs will hatch 6 to 10 weeks after they've been laid by the female. But you can go into your trees right now and see, will I have cicadas? So if you're living in Wheeling, West Virginia, where you've got brood 5 and probably possibly some outskirts there with brood 9 as well. Probably brood 8, excuse me. Probably we have some brood 8 and probably some brood 5 and brood 8. You can go up into your trees and you can count back in time by looking for the annual growth scar if you know your tree morphology. Here's 1-year-old egg nest at the bottom, and they show how the tree is beginning to heal from the egg damage, and that healing will continue. At the top, you see a 17-year-old egg nest from cicadas. And when I have to go out looking for cicadas, I actually can go back into trees and go back in time to find where are those old egg nests. The 17-year cicada branch is about this diameter, about the size of a quarter. If you don't know if you can't find the annual scars, but it's something really neat to do to know where to. And then if you find those things, dig straight down below that. That's where you're going to find the nymphs. After she lays her eggs, they die. The males will die. The females will die, and they produce quite an odor as their bodies start to decay with a little bit of the summer rain and what have you. And this gives me a point to talk about what are the benefits of periodical cicadas, and they have many. During the 17 years that they're underground, they're turning over soil like earthworms, and that's beneficial for our soil. When they come out of those holes in the ground, that's beneficial because it's like a natural aeration. It allows water to get to the soil better. It allows it to cope better with weather conditions during the summer months. It helps stop fungi from growing and so on. When they come out in massive numbers as adults, it's a food pulse for all sorts of animals. As I mentioned, raccoons, rodents, birds, all sorts of animals enjoy periodical cicadas, but they can't rely on it because it only comes out once every 17 or 13 years. When the female lays her eggs in the trees, that's like a natural pruning and results in a greater flower set the next year the tree flowers. That's beneficial for the tree. And then after they die, as you see here, all these cicadas rot and those nutrients go into the soil, feeding the tree and the cicadas for the next 17 years. If you need a science fair project and you're in a cicada area, you can collect the egg nests. Do this in September because by then they'll all be hatched. And you can actually dissect out the eggs to see which ones had a greater hatch rate. Here on the left, you see an unhatched egg. It's solid. On the right is a hatched egg. And you see it's basically almost like a piece of cellophane in the shape of an egg. That embryo insect developed into the insect and indeed hatched. As soon as those eggs hatch, they crawl out of the egg nest and they literally drop straight to the soil. In the upper right, you see a 1-minute-old cicada nymph. They're awfully cute when they're small, aren't they? What that nymph does is it drops straight to the soil because it's so susceptible to predation by spiders, ants, and ground beetles. They go down to the soil, and as soon as they hit a blade of grass, they run down that blade of grass. I've seen this happen. It's really cool. They get down into the soil as soon as possible. And they'll feed on grass roots for the next several weeks. And then by New Year's Day, they are 8 to 12 inches below the surface, sucking on a tree root. So what comes out of the egg nest, as you saw here, is a first instar nymph. Here on the lower left is a second, then above it, the third, the fourth, and the fifth instar is at the very top. And this graph that you see shows that they grow at different rates. Even though they're all the same age, they don't grow at the same rate. At year 3, you can find both second and third instars. At age 7, you can find third, fourth, and fifth instars. And that is true for age 7, 8, and 9, and 10. By the time they're 13 years old, they're all at the fifth and their last instar. That's the last time they will no longer molt underground. They will not molt again until they climb out of the soil and transform into the adult in their 17th year. So that's what goes on with the life of the periodical cicadas. But one of the things that I want to talk about tonight is also brood 10, because brood 10 is the brood that gave us most of our information about what we know about cicadas. Brood 10 was first observed near, I believe, near this church that you see here. This is the Gloria Dei Swedish Lutheran Church in Philadelphia. This church still stands. And it was on May the 9th, 1715, that Andreas Sandel wrote in his journal, "This month, some singular flies came out of holes in the ground. The English call them locusts. When they left the ground, holes could be seen everywhere in the roads, and especially in the woods. They were encased in shells, out of which they crawled. It seemed most wonderful how, being covered with the shell, they were able to burrow their way in the hard ground. When they began to fly, they made a peculiar noise, and being found in great multitudes all over the country, their noise made the cowbells inaudible in the woods. They were also destructive, making slits in the bark of the trees, where they deposited their worms, which withered the branches. Swine and poultry ate them. But what was more astonishing, when they first appeared, some of the people split them open and ate them, holding them to be that of the same kind as those said to have been eaten by John the Baptist." That's our first record of Brood 10, 1715. It was made by the pastor who was working in this church. This church still stands. And so I've asked colleagues, newspaper reporters I've interviewed with in Philadelphia, if someone could go down to the church and see if the cicadas are still there, because this is like the Brood 10 mothership to me. Now, they also merged in 1732. Ben Franklin was involved with that one. 1749, that's when a student of Linnaeus's came over from Sweden, visited Brood 10, and took specimens back to Sweden. And that's why Linnaeus, the Swedish biologist, named the 17-year cicada septendecim. One of the interesting things that was discovered was that in 1749, a man by the name of Benjamin Benneker witnessed his first periodical cicada emergence. That was the same year that Per Kalm was here. That was Linnaeus's student. He also witnessed the cicadas in 1766, 1783, and 1800. Benjamin Benneker was a free black American. His mother was a freed slave. His father was from the Caribbean and was never a slave. And this young man had an incredible mathematical ability. He borrowed books from a man by the name of Ellicott City's fame, and taught himself mathematics to the point where he could calculate when solar and lunar eclipses were going to happen. He was also involved in the surveying of what became Washington, D.C. But what was interesting for me was, in the year 1800, he wrote in a diary of his observations of seeing 3 broods of periodical cicadas and expected them to come in again, although he didn't add anything to that. Now, he wasn't the first to know that they were 17 years. That was known by Per Kalm, who in 1756 published that indeed they come out in 17-year sequences. He based that on historical data. He was Benneker was one of the first to actually observe 3 and indeed 4. He died, I believe, in 1806. What was interesting for me, though, when I read his diary, was that he wrote the following: "The hindermost parts rots off, and does not appear to be of any pain for them, for they continue singing until they die." What he was describing was the phenomenon of an advanced fungal infection, which we now recognize occurs in cicadas. The middle picture you see shows 2 cicadas where their tips of their abdomen have fallen off, and they're flying around spreading the fungal spores. The one I'm holding in the far lower right-hand corner, the abdomen hasn't completely fallen off yet, but it's about to, and it's filled with this chalky mass of fungal spores. And this fungus changes the behavior of cicadas. It turns them into these mating machines, where this male who has lost all his reproductive structures is now trying to mate with every female he can attract. But what he's doing is inoculating her with the fungal spores. What's really strange, if he hears a male call for a female, he'll pretend to be the female to attract that male and to mate and inoculate him as well. Now, Benneker did not know that was caused by the fungus, but he was the first to make that observation, and the fungal affiliation wasn't determined until 1851. 1834 and 1851 is when we have 2 individuals coming into play. One is Nathaniel Potter, and Potter is a fascinating individual. He was a medical doctor who decided he's going to start studying cicadas in 1783. He didn't get around to it. The year 1800, didn't get around to it. 1817, didn't start. 1834, he's getting up in years. He decides he has to do this and needs help. And so he gets the help of Gideon B. Smith to help him. And together they work out all the details they could from brood 10's emergence in 1834. And in 1839, they published the first standalone publication on periodical cicadas, including this hand-colored watercolor plate of the male and the female. Here's the male in the middle, the females to the left, the newly emerged nymphal cicada, the shape of the egg, a female laying her eggs, the nymphal skin, the egg-laying structure, and the sound-producing structure is all part of that. Smith, I should go back here. Smith took over the project in the 1840s and started crowdsourcing periodical cicadas. He would write newspaper columns, letters to editors, saying, I expect the cicadas to emerge in your part of the U.S. this year. I'd appreciate if your readers would send me notice. And by the time Smith died in 1867, he had documented all the living broods of cicadas. Not the total distribution, but he documented they existed. I was able to put this in yet, but we just recently located a photograph of Gideon Smith. So that'll be coming forward in a future publication. 1868, this man with a flamboyant mustache is Charles Valentine Riley, and he stepped in after Smith died to continue the mapping out of periodical cicadas. He worked out the details of a 13-year cicada life cycle. Even though Smith had done it 10 years earlier, Smith's manuscript was never published. Riley was unaware of it, but Riley was a gifted artist. He did the painting that you see on the left, but he worked out all the details of fundamental aspects of periodical cicada biology. He eventually, in 1869, became the first state entomologist of Missouri, and by 1885 became the second U.S. national entomologist, working out of Washington, D.C. 1902. This is something that had a little parallel this last week. You may have heard President Biden's speech at Arlington National Cemetery recently, and you could hear the cicadas in the background. That also happened in 1902, another brood 10 year, when Theodore Roosevelt gave an address at Arlington National Cemetery. Now, I'm originally from North Dakota, and this story had meaning for me. After Roosevelt's wife and mother died within 24 hours of each other, he was in such grief, he bought interest in a cattle ranch and moved out to western North Dakota, way up in the northwest, the upper left-hand corner of the map I'm showing you here, bought interest in a cattle ranch, and he herded cattle. And he learned to project his voice over this herd of cattle. Now, Roosevelt boxed in college at Harvard. He was a barrel-chested man who could project his voice and project it over a herd of running cows. In 1902, when he addressed Arlington National Cemetery, and you see a photograph in the lower right of him during that address, the cicadas are screaming, and the cicadas almost drowned him out. That's how loud they could get. I find that quite an interesting story in history. In 1919, we see the USDA is coordinating a number of mapping efforts to figure out where brood 10 is. You can see our map from 1902 at the bottom. And it's during this time that we started to see that there is that the prediction that there might be danger to the periodical cicadas from the agricultural clear cutting that was going on to make more lands available for growing corn and wheat and other field crops. And so in 1919, the USDA was worried that there might be a time when brood 10 might not exist at all. And that is one of the concerns that my lab has right now, is what's our impact on the overall status of brood 10. In 1936, Marlott, this man Marlott was who came up with the numbering system I told you about earlier, is replaced by James Hislop, and he now is the major cicada researcher. He fortunately saved a lot of the data that was missing from periodical cicada records. He also made the first movie of periodical cicadas. There's a frame for that movie that you're seeing here in black and white, which he narrated himself. So there was a lot of interest in brood 10. Brood 10 didn't emerge in 1953, but during World War II, the USDA stopped their mapping efforts, and they started relying on individual researchers. A little bit of culture here. And when the Brood 10 emerged in 1970, that was when Princeton University gave Bob Dylan an honorary degree. He came into the ceremony and was sat up on the platform and was seated next to Coretta Scott King, who also received an honorary doctorate. He was seen talking with her. And he's sitting there listening to the ceremony. And he was kind of fun. He didn't give the commencement speech. He just got the degree. And after it was done, he walked off, took off his cap and gown, gave it to some assistant, got in a limo and left. Went back to California, and he wrote "The Day of the Locust," a song about what he experienced at his commencement. Let's listen to a few frames of that. Bob Dylan, so inspired by periodical cicadas, he wrote a song about it. And that's one of the neat things about the cicadas. They've inspired poetry by Ogden Nash. They inspired now periodical cicadas didn't do this with Van Gogh, but he did draw cicadas. It's amazing how these insects have attracted lots and lots of attention. So the research that followed was in 87 and 2004. And this is my own work here in Ohio and Indiana. And you'll notice that the prediction that the cicadas are going to be in decline is showing evidence that it's actually happening. In the map of these two states, the large circles are areas where the cicadas are in great big numbers, like I'm seeing right now on my windows here. And that's in the southern half of Indiana and parts of southwest Ohio.
The call is his way of attracting a female. The females reply with a quite different sound. A click made by flicking her wings. So that's what the males are listening out for. I can imitate the female's wing flip with a snap of my fingers. And that causes them to follow me anywhere because they're so determined to find a female. Can I bring you back? How about coming this way?
Yes, Sir David Attenborough, frustrating cicadas at Mount St. Joseph University in 2004. So here we are, 2021. Coming to an area near you. We do have a spot out in Washington Courthouse, Washington County, where cicadas have been reported in the past. We're hoping to see if they really are occurring there. It may be closer to where you are, but we're mapping these things out to find out, are they really threatened or not? The primary tool we're using is my app, Cicada Safari, which I'm tickled to tell you right now has been downloaded 179,000 times, and we will probably have over 500,000 photographs of periodical cicadas to analyze. Right now, we're at 479,000 photographs that we're analyzing. So that's what we're waiting for this year, to find out how heavily distributed is Brood 10. Is it really threatened or not? And get this baseline map to help us understand what the cicada's future is when they come out again in 2038. Thank you for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed the program, and I'll turn this over to Sean.
Okay, here I am. Excellent. I put up the website for the app is running at the bottom of the screen right now for Cicada Safari. Fascinating stuff, these bugs. So we have some questions. Let's start with Barb. I'll put it on the screen.
Okay. Something's bugging me. Well, it turns out periodical cicadas, the 7 species we have, are endemic to the eastern U.S. They're as unique to the eastern U.S. as giraffes are to Africa, which is the analogy I've often used. But they're not the only periodical cicadas. There's 2 other cicadas that have been found recently that are periodical. One is in Fiji, and it has an 8-year life cycle, and the other occurs in India with a 4-year life cycle. But the 7 species we have here with the red eyes and the black body and the orange wings, those are unique to the eastern U.S. Just like the monarch butterfly is only found here. You have relatives of the monarchs in Africa and Europe, but not the true monarch. And so it has to do with isolation and their subsequent evolutionary history.
Okay, cool. Here's a really interesting comment from my colleague. Just wanted to get your comment on that.
Found online, the Civil War Union soldiers. Let's look at this. I'm going to go back. This is going to require going into my book and looking at the table. The periodical Brood 10 emerged in 1868, therefore had no impact on the Civil War. We do have what broods would have come out during the Civil War years. So Brood 4, Broods 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. None of those came out in Confederate states. So I'm skeptical of the note that they may have interfered with the Confederate soldiers. They did come out in Iowa and in Missouri, in the northern states, all the way into eastern Ohio, but not where any battles were being fought during the Civil War.
Fair enough. Here's another question from Gene.
How rapidly can a brood expand? It seemed that the most they can move is probably a mile or less per emergence year. I've actually done some experiments with this, looking at it's sort of interesting. We found an area in Cincinnati where they'd gone in and clear cut all the trees out of an area, dug the infrastructure, put in the sewer lines, the telephone lines, the power lines, cable, buried it all, put in new roads, and then they planted the trees. Not a single cicada emerged in that development in 2004. But before the emergence was done, thousands flew in to the trees that had been planted there 10 years earlier. In fact, that second slide I showed, where I talked about them coming out in greater and greater numbers, all those trees are on that trunk, that was taken in that development. Not a single cicada emerged under that tree. They all flew in. The closest tree that had cicadas was about a quarter of a mile away. Most of them came from about 3/4 of a mile away to a much denser population. So what happens if it's a very heavy emergence, the female runs out of oviposition sites, and the males might have difficulty competing for mates. So they'll actually fly out and start singing at some distance, attracting more males, and that attracts more females. And so that allows them to expand. But they don't expand definitely not more than a mile per emergence.
Here's a question about pesticides.
Have modern pesticides endangered any of the broods? Well, that's a very good question. I appreciate that. Pesticides that generally, if they're sprayed onto a tree, are going to be ineffective because cicadas don't have pads on their legs, nor do they chew on the leaves to pick up the pesticide. We do have a couple instances where I've been working on this year to see if it has an impact, and that's the systemic pesticides injected into ash trees to stop the emerald ash borer. And that does seem to have an impact on I've got several ash trees that have been injected on the property that I bought just a few years ago, and we only found one shell on one ash tree, that had the injected systemic insecticides. All the other trees around us were having big numbers. So that appears that's having an impact there. I did hear some people say they're going to have their yards sprayed as soon as the nymphs came out to kill them. How true that was, I'm not sure if that had an impact or not. But generally speaking, the greatest threat right now to periodical cicadas is the reduction of habitat, clear cutting. Every time we build a road, every time we put a high energy transmission power line, every time we fracture, we cut through a woodland, we interfere with cicada habitat.
I'm going to put this question up because I've read some of your book and I know the answer to this. But this is something, as I grew up, here it is. We called them locusts, and we know that's a misnomer.
Yeah, are cicadas related to the hordes of locusts that are mentioned in the Bible? No, they're not. This goes back to the quote that I would do from 1715. The English called them locusts. In 1699, a man named Paul Dudley witnessed the emergence of Brood 11 in Massachusetts. In 1716, he witnessed them again, and then he wrote this rather elaborate paper. And to figure out what they were, he asked a Reverend Weld if he could help him. And they went to the King James Version of the Bible. These things came out in great numbers. They laid their eggs. They didn't know they were laying their eggs. They caused the trees to wither. They thought they were eating things. So therefore, they were like the plagues of Exodus. They know in the New Testament about John the Baptist eating locusts and honey. That's actually a misinterpretation by Tyndall. It turns out John the Baptist didn't eat the insects. He ate the locust tree, which is a carob tree in the Middle East. So it was not the insect. But it was it talks in Revelation about this animal that comes from deep depths of the ground. And Micah, there's an animal that sings. They're all locusts. And it turned out in creating the King James Version of the Bible, relying on the Tyndall version of the Bible, they misinterpreted a number of entomological terms as certain specific insects. For example, the King James Version talks about a beetle. There are no beetle words for beetle in the original versions that we have, the oldest versions that we have. So they basically misinterpreted the locust and cicada. And indeed, when Dudley mailed his manuscript to the Royal Society in London in 1734, it caused a big stir because they said he has mistaken a locust for cicada and wrote him that. And he said, no, I know from Reverend Weld, this is in reality a locust. So the Royal Society arranged to send a locust, an Egyptian locust from Cairo to Boston. And it got there intact. But Dudley said, you're right. These are not locusts. They are cicadas. But I'm sorry that the popular will call them locusts for years. And they have for 2 more centuries after that. It's only in the last 51 years, that we've seen a real decline in the use of the word locust for these things. Locusts are grasshoppers. And when the grasshopper becomes migratory, then they get this activity. We call those locusts in part because of that behavior. And they actually go through and they just literally chew up everything in their swath of where they travel. We used to have migratory locusts in the U.S. There's a book published a few years ago by a good friend of mine, Jeffrey Lockwood, called Locust. The last locust, for example, where I'm from, was collected in North Dakota in 1831. And but we used to have massive locust plagues in the U.S. Not cicada plagues, but they called locusts and cicadas the same term.
That's probably why it's stuck in our memory.
Oh yeah,
yeah. Okay, here's another question.
Would these dead cicadas been a good addition to certainly, although it's better to leave them around the trees because that nutrient cache is basically returning some of the nutrients that the cicadas took out of the trees as they were developing. So you certainly couldn't put them in a composting pile, but they're better unless you take some of the compost to put that around the trees later. But it's best to leave them with the trees. Studies have found that actually those nutrients do go in the soil and form a nice band of nutrients around the roots for the next 17 years.
Okay. I'm putting up this picture because this is from 2016. So this would be Brood 5. This is right outside my front door.
Very cool.
They're climbing menacingly on the tree there. It's a maple tree.
Yeah. Aren't they amazing? Are they great?
They're great. Let's see. Another question. Oh, Teresa would like to see the chart.
Well, I froze that chart. Yes, I can. Well,
it's in your book, right?
It's in the book on page 51.
Yeah, there it is. You may very well win the book and be able to look at the chart.
There we are. Close up. There you go. Take a screen dump. You got it all, Teresa? It's pretty easy to figure out. If you start with 1621, Brood 1, take you to Brood 14 at 1634. You can actually just do an Excel file like I did and spread it out pretty quickly. But it is rather comforting. As I said, we didn't know when this pandemic was going to end, but I felt pretty comfortable saying the cicadas are going to emerge in May.
Right.
And there's something about that. The last time Halley's Comet came out in 1986, it was a real bust because then back in the early part, I think it was 1910 or 20, somewhere in there, it was spectacular. And I took out we had a science club at the university, and I had him come out to my house at 4 a.m. to see Halley's Comet. It was this little wisp of nothing. It was like, but at least they got cocoa. It was cold. But there's something comforting about the cicadas actually emerging like they're supposed to,
Yeah, absolutely. I even made the comment while you were talking that the sound is reassuring to me. It reminds me of being young and, just the idea that they keep coming back. I don't know. I like the sound, even though it's ear splitting sometimes.
Yeah. Well, they are the bugs of history. And I've talked to many families that talk about, and I had one lady basically send me just a couple of weeks ago, send me the stories about, I think my favorite one of all these is a young woman, or not young one. In 1987, I got this phone call that she was playing with her brother in 1936 when a cicada landed on his nose. And she decided to get it off his nose by using his baseball bat and broke his nose.
Oh.
And so that was the big story. 1953, she's now a young mother and has a young daughter in her preschool years, and she's out there showing her young daughter the cicadas.
How cool is that?
1970, her daughter is a young mother, and she's got her grandchild out there showing her the cicadas. Now we're in 1987, and she's telling me these stories and how they still talk about how she broke her brother's nose in 1936. And I don't know if she's still with us. I would hope she would, but she probably isn't. If she made it to 2004, but this would be a little longer now. She'd be well in her hundreds by now. But that family is reminiscing these stories. A periodical cicada emergence is like a life history event. Life history events are weddings, they're births, they're funerals. They're things that bring families together and a common memory that binds. And cicadas can do that.
Yeah.
Sean, how many broods have you experienced in your lifetime?
How many broods?
Yeah, how many broods have you witnessed?
Well, I go back to 1966, so.
So, were you are you always in West Virginia?
Yeah. Well, I was in DC for a while, but not while Brood 10 was out.
So. Well, Brood 10 would have been 1970, so you already moved by age 4.
Right.
So where were you living in Virginia then? By what? By 4?
No, I was kidding. I lived in Virginia when I was in law school, so it was years later.
Oh, okay. So Virginia would have been Brood 2 as well. Were you in the East Coast or the West side of Virginia?
Manassas and Silver Spring.
Okay, so you had Brood 2 then. So you were probably, 1979?
No. I was in Wheeling until that was in the 90s.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, there was a 96 Brood 2.
Yeah, I was.
Manassas.
I was back by then. But anyway, I just remember them. Like I said, 1987, so 7, even when I was 4 here, Brood 5, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, Brood 5 would have been 82. We would have had 99.
Okay.
And
right, I'm talking about 10 still because it's in my mind because I wanted to bring this up. We found an article from 2004 in our newspaper about Brood 10, and guess who was quoted in that article?
Who?
Dr. Gene Kritsky.
Oh my! I'm not dead yet. I don't want to get on the cart. I'm still happy. So what year is that? 99?
87. No, 2004. 2004.
Okay, yeah, I did a lot of PR in 2004. I started doing Brood 10 in 87. It was my first real big emergence, and so I was on the ABC News that year, and I made the front page of the USA Today, things like that.
Well, it was an AP. You may very well have been in the 87 story. I didn't notice, but definitely 2004. Okay, here's another question because we have evolution of insects next week. So
okay, assuming all the periodical cicadas started from an evolutionary standpoint from a single brood, how did all the different broods begin to emerge in different years? That's a great question, Aaron. It turns out we recently have some good data on that. First of all, cicadas, the family Cicadidae. I co-described with my good friend George Pinar the oldest cicada nymph. It was from the Burmese amber 110 million years ago, which meant that before the ancestor of tyrannosaurs, walking through the forests of the late Cretaceous, we're hearing cicadas calling in the trees. That just inspires me. I went to COSI, Columbus, a few months ago, before the pandemic, and they have a recreation, a diorama of the late Cretaceous woods, and they had cicada shells in there. I felt like, I've influenced a diorama in a dinosaur hall. How great is that? So, but the family Cicadidae, the family that we're talking about, we have good not modern, but good cicadas with good cicada venation by 20 million years ago, during the Dominican amber. The common ancestor of all the periodical cicada species lived during the Pliocene, and 3.9 million years ago, this is based on DNA data, that's when it split into one large species and the one small species. 3.9 million years ago. That small species diverged into two small species 2.5 million years ago. Now you get your three species groups, the Decim, Cassini, and Decula. And then 500,000 years ago, the large Decim split into Septendecim and Tredecim, your 13 and 17 year forms. And then within the last 300,000 years, all the other species and the life cycles evolved. And the evolution of the long life cycle now looks like it evolved, that the 13-year form is ancestral to the 17-year form. Because if you remember that map, I had all those red dots in the southern part of the eastern United States. That's south of where the glaciers were during the Ice Age. And so closer to the Ice Age, you find the ancestors of the 17-year forms, which is thought by many to have been a genetic switch that allowed them not to emerge this year because it was too cold out there, and they could stay underground for 4 more years. That'd be a way of coping with the retreating glaciers. And so the long life cycle is thought to be related to the glaciation. The broods all evolved within the last 200,000 years. And case in point, here in Western Ohio, where I'm living now, where I'm seated at this moment, I'm about 25 miles south of where the great ice sheet stopped during the last Wisconsin glaciation. There were no cicadas in Western Ohio because there's no forests here. At the end of the Pliocene, we started the interwarming period and the retreat of the glaciers north. They were north of Toledo by 14,000 years ago. As they moved north, the trees came with them. The cicadas came with the trees. And so if you look at the overall distribution, especially of cicadas in Ohio, which is what I focus on, we have these major physiographic regions, which are geological, topological, that influence the kind of vegetation you see between the beech maple forest here and the hickory forest over here, and so on. The Brood 5 has a different physiographic region than Brood 10 is, and in the southern part between the two and below them is Brood 14. And so we see all that, the different ecozones, ecological zones that occurred after the retreat of the ice ages influence how the cicadas spread into the areas. And I just find that fascinating. We're still getting more and more information as we better understand the end of the last ice age. We're getting a lot of very good information. In particular, if you look at adjacent broods to each other, here in Southwest Ohio, we got brood 14, 10, and now some 6, 4 years apart, 4-year cycle switches. Out east in West Virginia and Virginia, we have brood 9, which is adjacent to 5, which is adjacent to 1, 4 years apart. So I think cicadas have been all along telling us what their secrets are. That they've been dispersing and evolving and changing their time period based on these 4-year jumps. And that's probably caused by just a single genetic switch that turns on 9-year growth, 13-year growth, 17-year growth, or 21-year growth. And we got cicadas that have been observed, periodical cicadas that have been observed coming out after 9 years, 13, 17, and 21 years. And so it looks like they have a switch that's it's n times 4 plus 1, where n is the number of time that switch is thrown. And that switch may need to be thrown depending on what the overall climatic conditions are at the time.
Sort of a follow-up question, I suppose. Very interesting. Let's try this one. Proto-periodical cicadas.
Well, when talking about proto-periodical cicadas, Aaron, these are cicadas that come out almost every year. Collectively, we call them annual cicadas, but some years they have a heavier emergence than others. And this may have been involved in the early evolution towards periodicity. There's one, for example, there's a group of cicadas in the southwest of the U.S. that has an 11-year life cycle, but one of those 11 years is heavier than the others. But a lot of the annual cicadas we have here, we do not know what their life cycle is. We don't know how many years ago the eggs that were laid that produced the annual cicadas that we'll see this year, but they come out every year. It's clearly going to be more than 1 year. That's one of the neat things that we're looking at. I've been involved with a number of experiments trying to figure out what the life cycle, what's the lifespan or the life cycle of some of these annual cicadas. But it's been elusive. One of the projects I was involved with was based on the hypothesis that they always climb up the tree closest to where they fell out of the tree as a young first instar nymph. They're sucking on those roots. They never move more than a yard probably in their entire 17 years or during their life cycle for the annual cicadas. And then they always would climb up the closest tree. And at Spring Grove Cemetery here in Cincinnati, which is a cemetery started back in the 1860s, they gave me access to all their planting records. And so the key was to go look for shells of cicada nymphs, of annual cicada nymphs. And when were those trees planted? And after the first year, we did not find the first year of my study, we didn't find a single shell under any tree that was younger than 5 years of age. That would imply that all those annual cicadas, the most of which they had, or Neotibicin, were at least 5 years old in life cycle. The second year, we tried to repeat it to get more consistent data. And I was very disappointed when I came back to my lab at the University at Mount St. Joe. And this is 9-10 o'clock at night. And I got my headlamp on, whatever. And here's this nymph. And it's clearly crawled up from under a maple tree, walking across the sidewalk in the opposite direction to climb up the trunk of a yellowwood. So the fundamental hypothesis was they're always under the tree. You can only find them on the tree is probably not true. So therefore, it didn't lead to what we hoped it might give us information on. But there have been attempts to grow cicadas in pots, and we've found ages of 5-7 years. But they lay eggs every year, and so we don't. So I hope that helps with the answer to that question, Aaron.
Thank you, sir. Excellent answer. Well, having no more questions pop up, let us give stuff away.
Yay!
First, a copy of this book, Periodical Cicadas by Dr. Gene. There it is. It's a good read. I've read 90% of it.
Then I won't send the quiz, Sean.
Okay. Okay, the first winner is Joan Kerrigan. Joan, you've won a book. Yay, Joan. And the second book goes to, and you'll have to trust me on these, Teresa Prince. Teresa asked a good question, and she's from Kentucky. So, get in touch and send me your address, and I'll mail a book out to you. And finally, your choice of the Brood PU tote bag or the T-shirt, which is like the one I'm wearing. So let's see who wins that. And the winner is Barb Lewine. Congratulations, Barb. Get in touch. Let me know if you want a T-shirt or a tote bag. Dr. Kritsky, thank you so much. Don't forget, next week, we're going to talk about grasshoppers. Be here, same bat place, same bat time, 6:30 p.m. on Thursday.
And talk about locusts.
Right. Real locusts. We really appreciate you joining us. Fascinating stuff. We could listen to you talk all night.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone who attended. We'll see you next week.